Breaking news from Beijing that just sent shockwaves through North American trade relations. In a stunning reversal that caught Washington completely off guard, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney announced Friday that Canada is slashing its 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles down to just 6.1%. Let that sink in for a moment. The same tariffs that Canada imposed just over a year ago at the urging of the United States are now being ripped up in what Carney himself is calling a landmark deal with President Xi Jinping. This isn't just a trade adjustment. This is Canada publicly breaking ranks with its largest trading partner and closest ally at the worst possible time. And the questions we need to answer are urgent. Why is this happening now? What does this mean for American workers and manufacturers? And how will Washington respond? Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you reveals three critical failures that are reshaping North American trade forever. Here's what just happened in Beijing. On Friday, January 16th, 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood alongside Chinese President Xi Jinping and announced that Canada will allow up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market annually at a preferential tariff rate of 6.1%. That's down from the 100% tariff Canada imposed in October 2024, a policy that effectively blocked all Chinese EV imports. The quota will expand to 70,000 vehicles by year 5 of the agreement. In exchange, China agreed to reduce its retaliatory tariff on Canadian canola from a combined 85% duty rate to approximately 15% by March 1st, 2026. China will also remove its 100% tariffs on Canadian canola meal, lobsters, crab, and peas. The deal, which Carney described as preliminary but landmark, marks a dramatic reset in Canada-China relations that had been frozen since 2018. But here's the critical context you need to understand. Canada didn't just wake up one morning and decide to cozy up to Beijing. This deal comes at a moment when the relationship between Canada and the United States has hit what Carney himself described as a rupture. President Trump has imposed tariffs on key Canadian exports, including lumber, steel, and automobiles. He's threatened Canadian sovereignty in public statements. And perhaps most alarming for Ottawa, Trump recently declared that the USMCA trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada is irrelevant. According to reports from multiple sources, including the New York Times and Politico, Carney told reporters in Beijing that China had become a more predictable partner to deal with than the United States, and that you see results coming from that. Read that again. A Canadian Prime Minister just said that communist China is more predictable than democratic America, and it gets worse. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who oversees a province with over 90,000 auto sector workers and 1.3 million vehicles produced in 2024, says he received zero consultation before this deal was announced. Ford called the agreement lopsided and warned it risks closing the door on Canadian automakers to the American market, our largest export destination, which would hurt our economy and lead to job losses. Let's break down the mechanics of this deal and why it represents such a seismic shift in North American trade policy. First, the tariff structure itself. Canada's 100% tariff on Chinese EVs was part of a coordinated North American strategy. The United States maintains similar protective tariffs, and Mexico just increased its own Chinese EV tariff to 50% from 20% on January 1st, 2026. The entire point was to create a unified North American auto market protected from what American and Canadian lawmakers have described as artificially cheap Chinese imports that threaten domestic manufacturing jobs. Now, Canada is breaking that unified front. Under the new agreement, 49,000 Chinese EVs will enter Canada annually at 6.1%, which is essentially the most favored nation rate. According to data from the Canadian auto industry, Canadians purchase approximately 1.8 million vehicles annually. So Carney argues these 49,000 Chinese EVs represent just under 3% of the total market, or what he calls a low single-digit proportion. But here's the kicker. These aren't luxury vehicles. According to reporting from Inside EVs, this deal opens the door to Chinese electric vehicles that cost less than $25,000. Canadian consumers currently face average vehicle purchase prices around $40,000. We're talking about EVs at nearly half that price point. And according to the agreement terms, China has committed to making a considerable investment into Canada's auto sector within the next 3 years, likely in the form of joint venture manufacturing facilities. Think about what this really means. Chinese automakers get access to North American consumers through the Canadian market. They potentially establish manufacturing presence on North American soil, and they do it all while undercutting American and Canadian domestic producers on price by massive margins. Now let's talk about the agricultural side of the equation. Canadian canola farmers have been crushed by Chinese tariffs that reached a combined 85% duty rate. The canola industry is worth billions to the Canadian prairie provinces. China's decision to slash those tariffs to 15% and remove the 100% duty on canola meal represents substantial relief for Canadian agriculture. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe traveled to Beijing with Carney specifically to advocate for canola farmers, and he's calling this a major victory. But there's a historical precedent we need to examine here, and it's troubling. Back in the 1980s, Japan faced similar accusations of flooding American markets with artificially cheap vehicles. The United States negotiated voluntary export restraints, and eventually Japanese automakers built plants on American soil, creating hundreds of thousands of American jobs. That's the model everyone points to as a success story. The difference here is geopolitical. China isn't 1980s Japan. China is actively engaged in what Western intelligence agencies describe as economic espionage, intellectual property theft, and strategic competition for global technological dominance. According to Canadian security forces, China has interfered in Canadian elections and sought to control and surveil Chinese Canadians on Canadian soil. Just 6 years ago, China arbitrarily detained 2 Canadian citizens for over 1,000 days after Canada arrested a Chinese business executive wanted by the United States. And now Canada is entering a strategic partnership with Beijing. Those are Carney's exact words from Friday's announcement. The timing tells us everything we need to know about the desperation driving this decision. According to Deloitte's recent economic analysis, Canada's economic growth is expected to slow to 1.5% in 2026, down from 1.7% in 2025. Trump's threats of sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, combined with his public statements questioning Canadian sovereignty, have created what analysts are calling the most uncertain trade environment in North American history. Wu Xinbo, dean at the Institute of International Studies at Fudan University in Shanghai, told the New York Times that China not only views Canada as an important economic partner, but also as a useful diplomatic counterweight in dealing with the United States. Let's be clear about what that means. China sees Canada as a pressure point against American interests. The deal structure itself reveals the asymmetry. Canada gets relief for one agricultural sector. China gets access to North American consumers, potential manufacturing presence, and most importantly, it drives a wedge into the North American alliance at a moment when unity would be absolutely critical in negotiations with Beijing. Carney defended the move by saying, "We take the world as it is, not as we wish it to be." But critics are asking whether he's taking the world as it is or reshaping it in ways that could have catastrophic long-term consequences for North American manufacturing and security. Let's break down exactly who gets hurt and who benefits from this decision, because the ripple effects are going to hit multiple sectors hard. American workers and families are watching their largest trading partner cut a side deal with their biggest economic competitor. If Chinese EVs establish a foothold in Canada at $25,000 price points, American consumers just across the border are going to ask why they're paying $40,000 or more for comparable vehicles. Pressure will mount on Washington to either match Canada's approach or face a competitive disadvantage. American auto workers at plants from Michigan to Tennessee have spent years warning about exactly this scenario where cheap Chinese imports undercut domestic production and lead to plant closures. Canadian auto workers face an even more immediate threat. Ontario, home to over 90,000 auto sector employees, just saw its premier completely shut out of negotiations. Doug Ford's warning about closing the door to American markets isn't hyperbole. If Chinese EVs are assembled or significantly modified in Canada and then exported to the United States under USMCA rules of origin provisions, Washington could respond by tightening those provisions or imposing additional scrutiny on Canadian auto exports. That would devastate an industry that depends on seamless cross-border supply chains. Professor Peter Fries from the University of Windsor, a leading automotive engineering expert, notes that while 49,000 vehicles represents only about 30 to 35 days of production at a single plant like Stellantis's Windsor assembly plant, the precedent is what matters. Once Chinese manufacturers establish dealer networks, brand recognition, and consumer trust in the Canadian market, those quotas can be renegotiated upward. We've seen this pattern before. Small businesses in the auto supply chain face catastrophic risk. Canada's auto sector isn't just assembly plants. It's thousands of small and medium-sized suppliers producing everything from electronic components to interior materials. If Chinese EVs capture even a small percentage of market share, those suppliers lose contracts. And unlike the major manufacturers, small suppliers don't have the resources to retool or pivot to other industries. We're talking about family-owned businesses that have been operating for generations, suddenly facing existential threats because of a deal negotiated in Beijing with zero consultation. Large corporations are already calculating their response. According to analysis from multiple industry sources, American automakers including Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis are deeply concerned about the precedent this sets. These companies have invested billions in North American EV production facilities based on the assumption that all three countries would maintain protective tariffs against Chinese imports. Now that assumption is shattered. Stock markets responded with volatility, and industry analysts are warning that this could trigger a reassessment of planned investments in both Canadian and American facilities. Canadian agricultural producers, particularly canola farmers, are the clear winners in the short term. Saskatchewan's canola industry stands to benefit from China reducing tariffs from 85% to 15%. That's real money back in farmers' pockets and could mean the difference between profit and loss for thousands of operations. But even here, experts warn about dependency. China has used agricultural access as a political weapon before, and there's nothing preventing Beijing from reimposing tariffs if Canada takes positions on Taiwan, Hong Kong, or Xinjiang that displease the Communist Party. International partners are watching this unfold with deep concern. Officials from multiple countries have expressed worry that Canada's move could fragment the Western alliance's approach to managing China's industrial overcapacity in the EV sector. The European Union has its own tariffs on Chinese EVs, and Brussels is now wondering whether Canada's decision will embolden other countries to break ranks and cut individual deals with Beijing. The human cost here extends beyond statistics. We're talking about communities built around automotive manufacturing, workers whose skills and livelihoods depend on an industry that could face systematic undermining, and families facing uncertainty about whether their jobs will exist in 5 or 10 years. The expert response to this announcement has been swift and largely critical. Ontario NDP leader Marit Stiles called it a crushing blow to the province's auto sector and accused both Ford and Carney of failing workers. She pointed out that Saskatchewan's premier flew to Beijing to advocate for his province's interests, while Ford was sitting at home, leaving Ontario workers with no one to fight for them. Trade policy experts are warning about the legal implications under USMCA. The agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada includes provisions designed to prevent exactly this type of third-party access to the North American market. If Chinese manufacturers use Canada as a backdoor to American consumers, Washington has legal grounds to invoke dispute resolution mechanisms or even consider the agreement compromised. The political fallout is already beginning. Sources close to the Trump administration indicate that this deal will be viewed as a betrayal at a time when the U.S. is trying to build a unified Western approach to Chinese industrial policy. One anonymous official described Canada's move as shooting ourselves in the foot while handing China the gun. From Beijing's perspective, this represents a strategic victory beyond the immediate economic terms. China has successfully driven a wedge between the United States and its closest ally, demonstrating to other countries that breaking with Washington can bring tangible benefits, and established a potential manufacturing presence in North America that could grow substantially over time. In the short term, the next 30 to 90 days will be critical. Watch for three key developments. First, the Trump administration's formal response. Will Washington impose additional restrictions on Canadian auto exports, tighten USMCA enforcement, or use this as justification for broader tariff actions? Second, the reaction from American auto manufacturers and their union workers. If major political pressure builds, it could force congressional action. Third, whether other countries begin signaling their own interest in similar arrangements with China, potentially unraveling years of coordinated Western trade policy. Medium-term scenarios over the next 6 to 12 months involve the actual implementation of the deal. China's promised considerable investment in Canada's auto sector will either materialize or it won't. If Chinese manufacturers do establish joint ventures or plants in Canada, the dynamics of the North American auto industry will shift permanently. Canadian workers might gain some jobs from Chinese investment, but the broader competitive pressure on the entire sector would intensify dramatically. The most concerning long-term implication is precedent. If Canada can successfully break with the United States on Chinese trade policy and face no significant consequences, why wouldn't other countries do the same? We could be witnessing the beginning of a broader fracturing of Western economic alliance structures that have defined global trade for decades. And all of this is happening because Canada felt it had no choice but to seek predictable partners elsewhere when faced with an unpredictable ally. Let's recap the three most critical points here. First, Canada just broke ranks with the United States and slashed tariffs on Chinese EVs from 100% to 6.1%, opening the door to 49,000 cheap Chinese vehicles entering North American markets annually. Second, this happened with zero consultation with key stakeholders like Ontario's auto sector, which employs over 90,000 workers and represents Canada choosing China as a more predictable partner than America. Third, the precedent this sets could unravel decades of coordinated North American trade policy and potentially devastate domestic auto manufacturing on both sides of the border. The key takeaway: when allies stop trusting each other, competitors like China win, and workers in Michigan, Ontario, and across the continent pay the price. What do you think? Is Canada making a pragmatic choice or a catastrophic mistake? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to stay informed on stories the mainstream media won't fully cover, make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell icon. The North American alliance just fractured over electric vehicles and cheap canola, and the consequences of that fracture will echo for years to come. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.